rebuild. This comes in the wake of, got it. I think these technologies keep requiring you to respond to them. This comes in the wake of the recent turmoil in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, the devastating impact of COVID-19 on lives, livelihoods, and our democracy generally, the low economic growth South Africa was experiencing before the pandemic and which worsened in 2020, and the challenges the state has been facing generally post the period of state capture. Our first session was on rebuilding communities, and the second one was on rebuilding economies. I see a large number of you have attended the first two. Those of you who have missed it can view the events on YouTube, and our colleagues will put the links up on the chat. After today's webinar, the GCRO MISTRA teams will be working on a publication which will bring the various inputs and discussions into one publication. We hope to release this in February 2022. Today's webinar is themed Rebuilding Government, and it examines the functionality of the state, focusing on some of the state weaknesses, as well as moments of resilience, which were exposed and exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the July 2021 events. In addition, this would be a good platform for us to reflect on the recently held local government elections, trying to answer the question, what is a capable state and how can we achieve it? Now, as the program director for this afternoon, one of my KPIs is to keep the speakers to their time limits. So the opening speaker and the panelists have been asked to speak for no longer than 10 minutes. After that, we'll have an open mic session where you're requested to speak for no longer than 5 minutes from the audience. This allows the session to get as many viewpoints and diverse voices. Please feel free to use the chat function to throw up questions and comments which we can also get the speakers to respond to. I'm going to just run through the program just to give you a quick idea of what to expect from the program now. And then thereafter, I'll introduce the speakers individually. So the opening remarks will be made by the Executive Director of Joel Netshitenzhe. The panelists will have Harsha Dial, who will speak on trust in government, exploring pathways to change using evidence. And then Graham Gotts will speak on social attitudes to governance in Gauteng. Nomzamo Zondo will speak on what did the July uprisings teach us about accountability. And the final panelist will be an input from Kwezi Mabasa on the local developmental state. What are the lessons we've learned from the past 27 years? Now, I think a number of you feel that you don't need an introduction to Joel Netshitenzhe, but it's useful to remind us of who he is, apart from him being my boss. Joel is the Executive Director and Vice Chairperson of the Board of MISTRA. His education qualifications include an MSc in Financial Economics and a postgraduate diploma in Economic Principles from the University of London and a diploma in Political Science from the Institute of Social Science in Moscow. He is a visiting professor at the Wits School of Governance. He has held several positions in government from 1994 to 2009, when he retired from government. He was the head of communication in President Mandela's office. He was the CEO of GCIS and the head of the policy unit in the presidency. He was also a member of the first National Planning Commission and is non-executive director of the CSIR and Life Healthcare Group. He has been a member of the National Executive Committee of the ANC since 1991. Over to you, Joel.
Thank you, Abba. I should start off by acknowledging leaders of the Gauteng provincial government who are here, as well as national government, as well as the Gauteng City Region Observatory, and all colleagues for attending this event. This series of webinars has cast a spotlight on practical things that need to be done to take our country onto a higher growth and development trajectory. In my understanding, a trajectory is more like a flight path, an arc. And we cannot discuss the issue of rebuilding government without answering the question about the direction in which the arc bends. In simple terms, it should be towards the prosperous, just, and equitable society envisioned in the Constitution. In terms of temporal objectives, I would argue that the targets set out in the National Development Plan still stand, though the timeframes may need to be adjusted given the experiences South Africa has gone through since 2012 when the NDP was adopted. But we still pursue a decent standard of living for all, an unemployment rate of 6% and below, a skilled population, basic amenities, and so on. It is appropriate that the concluding webinar should be on rebuilding the state because it is the ultimate authority in society. Without it, national objectives cannot be met. And I'm deliberately using the word state because I think our gaze should be towards all instruments of governance. Now, as we reflect on rebuilding, we need to remember that while the state was hollowed out during the period of systemic corruption and state capture, many functions continued to chug along. Perhaps in some instances directionless, and in other instances as piggy banks. The task now is to focus on what needs to happen going forward. As the NDP was being finalized in 2012, there was some debate about prioritization. An element of that was about the chicken and egg dynamic of whether you can pursue the NDP objectives without a capable developmental state, or whether such a state would be the product of the plan's implementation. I'm not sure whether the issue was conclusively resolved, but there was a common understanding that the path elaborated in the plan could not be pursued without at least developmental orientation and requisite capability within the state. The attributes of such developmentalism are of profound relevance to today's discussion. And these are strategic acumen for visioning, legitimacy for ideational leadership, appropriate macro-organization of the state, and a skilled and effective bureaucracy. These are defining characteristics of a developmental state, though many such states emerged during specific historical periods, as well as geopolitical and cultural settings. I will try briefly to link these attributes to South Africa's current experiences. The past decade, as we all know, was a wasted opportunity. In my view, largely because we spent an opportunity to start implementing a time-bound vision broadly agreed to in society. 2012 was a kind of eureka moment because you would have to go back to the mid-1990s to find a similar level of societal consensus. The 2012 opportunity was squandered, and the trust earned since 1994 dissipated. The issue is whether the hope and trust of the post-2017 period are now also waning. Related to this is the outcome of the recent local government elections, which of course is not the purpose of today's discussion. Two issues about trust and ideational leadership attached to current challenges. Firstly, the slow pace of implementation of reforms and the unethical conduct uncovered in relation to COVID-19 resources, which undercut a large part of the goodwill that was starting to emerge. The second issue is about an objective situation that faces reforming government. That reforms do come with some pain as you correct past mistakes. And this can in turn lead to popular dissatisfaction if poorly undertaken and poorly communicated. Rebuilding, therefore, should include openness with the public about the gain and the pain. Critical to this is a social compact among all partners with a preparedness to contribute and to sacrifice for the common good, but also, I think, a steeliness of the state to pursue national objectives even when consensus cannot be reached. What also needs strengthening is joined up leadership. It has been a struggle since 1994 to transform the fragmented apartheid state and ensure horizontal as well as vertical alignment in planning and implementation. The problem, in my view, is not so much with the Constitution, but in the management of intergovernmental relations across the spheres and intragovernmental coherence within each sphere. Hopefully, the district development model will be effectively implemented and a pilot agency at the center of government will emerge with the authority and leverage to ensure that all fall in line. Many had thought departmental fiefdoms were fast disappearing post-2019, but the unedifying spectacle among security ministries during the July 2021 unrest demonstrated that the turnaround is still some distance away. Integration is even more critical now, given, for instance, some of the worrying security trends emerging in the electricity sector and the multifaceted impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the crucial lessons from Southeast Asia is about a meritocratic bureaucracy. This is not only about technical capability. It also entails employing functionaries who embrace the vision of the government and are able to translate it into implementable programs. Both COVID-19 and the July failed insurrection brought out in bold relief the fundamental questions about vision, ideational and legitimate leadership, social compacting, appropriate macro-organization of the state, and an efficient bureaucracy. These misfortunes have generated extremes of selfishness and social solidarity, social upheaval, and a people in political motion for good. Across all the spheres of government, we need to encourage the positive impulses. In this way, we will not only douse the flames of our social tinder, but climb back onto that trajectory described in the National Development Plan, as well as the recent objectives elaborated in the Reconstruction and Recovery Plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joel. You really appreciate it. You've set the bar high for the rest of the panel. I hope we can rise to the occasion, and I look forward to the engagement and what you've been saying so far. So our first speaker is going to be Harsha Dayal. As I indicated, she'll be speaking on trust in government, exploring pathways to change using evidence. She is the Director of Research in the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation within the Presidency of South Africa. Her roots lie actually in the medical sciences. I was quite surprised to read, and worked for 14 years as a health professional before she moved to the social sciences during her 7 years at the HSRC. In 2012, she moved to the presidency to manage the high-level 20-year review. And I think that's where MISRA and DPME worked very closely in producing that report. And then in undertaking and collaborating with the wider research community and policy-relevant research, she has developed a number of strategies to bridge the gap between researchers and policymakers. Currently, she also serves on several advisory bodies and reference groups nationally and internationally. Harsha, as you're coming to the podium, so to speak, I just want to acknowledge some of the people thus far. And notice that the ex-GCRO Executive Director, Rob Moore, is present. So really glad to have you here, and I hope you are happy with what your successors are doing. We're also blessed with the presence of A.D. Enthoven of Hollard, Annette Friesel, Deputy DG from the DPME, Lisa Seftel from NEDLAC, Professor Alison Toders, Yaki Cilliers of ISS, and Professor Anthony Butler. As I pick up other names, I will expose you guys, hoping that you will make an input at the discussion time. Thank you. Over to you, Harsha.
Thank you so much, Abba, and certainly a very high standard bar after following from Joel's input. So just to, and I'm glad you mentioned the names in just before the introduction. And really, I think that the input that I'm going to give today is based on a research report that we launched in August 2021, which is available on DPM's website and the policy brief as well. So there's a whole team behind this work, and I also want to acknowledge all the senior management officials that are present here at this webinar today. For this session, and given the time limits, I will draw on just a few salient points to contribute to this intellectual space that has been created this afternoon. So there we go, it's moving at least. So why trust in government? And we wanted to understand this phenomenon of trust in the first place, not just in terms of its academic background, but also focusing on government, specifically government as one of the state institutions. We started with this work in October 2020, when trust by citizens became the focal point of many governments internationally. We responded to this alert when governments became central in managing the pandemic, but at the same time, exposed the many familiar fault lines that we're experiencing today. We undertook this international benchmark exercise asking these questions, but we also know that contextualizing it for South Africa was as important as the benchmarking exercise. So what we found is that trust is both a process and an outcome, and therefore an effective construct for planning. In order for political systems to function, and I think this is what Joel has been referring to much in terms of legitimacy through public support of the structures, processes, and systems of the state institutions, and particularly of government. Trust adds public value instrumentally through day-to-day interactions between citizens and the government, and symbolically as a resource for a stable and flourishing democracy. As an outcome, it is a strong judgment for government performance with regard to competence and intentions of government. We found many interacting factors, interacting influential and relational factors that actually impact on trust. And these are discussed in more details in the full report. But if I take the international benchmarking exercise alone, some insights do come forward. In terms of the findings, it's reinforcing what is known by us as South Africans, but also demonstrates a little bit of a shift in the trends. What is clear is that trust in public institutions is declining. There's no argument against that, although there is great heterogeneity across cases and across countries. Different measures of trust makes us cast a very cautionary eye when interpreting the data, though. On an intuitive level, trust is known to be sensitive to events and hence becomes a more important consideration in the interventions by government. Government performance on service delivery is not just important for institutional trust, but also for social trust, which can be built by the state. One of the most classic and longest generators of trust data is in the USA by the Pew Research Center, and that dates back right from 1958. What we see here is that there are trends, and in between the peaks and the bounds, there's a lot of different ways of interpreting, but we add the historical and political events in this data set, the narrative emerges. So if we, in 2014, a plotting of trust versus GDP per capita brought out the direct relationship between trust by citizen and inequality. These countries in the upper outer quadrant are the known welfare states, as Joel had also pointed to the developmental states, while the majority of the countries are in the lower quadrant with low GDP and low levels of trust. South Africa is positioned there in the circle. So this was the first kind of very real data that was coming forward in terms of the linking directly inequality through GDP per capita and trust. What we see then is that, and what we did was distilled the vast evidence into a causal path. In summary, the basis of trust is strong social ties and a sense of community, and bringing in the efforts of all the social cohesion, which is actually central to sustaining both institutional and social trust. We see how competence and values of government influence both types of trust, and that effective analysis depends on a combination of subjective, objective, as well as experimental data. I think the aspects of, sorry, I'm just trying to go into the next slide. So the key outcomes for the South African context is we all can have our different evidence in front of us. We looked at these core variables at a national level, government compared with other public institutions, on inequality, corruption, social cohesion, race relations, and active citizenry, violence, crime, media, and the COVID-19 pandemic. A key message is that trust in the three spheres of government differs, where local government has the lowest levels of trust and clearly reinforced with the results of the recent elections. But this is different according to international trends, where local levels are higher levels of trust than compared to the national states. Mistra, and I think even the panelists today, Mistra had alerted us through these scenarios and most convincingly pointing us to the society moving the Gwara state, which concurs with the low levels of trust. And then equally, GCRO has generated consistent disaggregated data over the years on the state of living standards in Gauteng. And this spatial data provides critical local evidence for tracking and linking development outcomes with levels of trust. So what we found is that in an evidence-informed diagnostic of the drivers of distrust in South Africa, we clearly see a link between GDP, views of corruption, race relations, all three closely related to and associated with trust by citizens. You can see that as GDP together with corruption and race relations are diminishing, so is trust, but corruption obviously is an inverse relationship. Where the majority of citizens depend on government for services for their lives and livelihoods, the very action of government can add to inequality and negatively influence race relations as well. So the urgency to address citizen trust in state institutions and social cohesion is further demonstrated by the recent outbreak, as has been mentioned. Up to this point, I shared the evidence generated, which can be analyzed in different ways. In DPME and part of the recommendations, we started reflecting on the complexities and translating the lessons learned. So the next 3 slides are to illustrate our current engagements and thinking through pathways to change using the lens of the capable, ethical, and developmental state as presented in the current MTSF, which is the implementation plans of the NDP. So, the first one and the question posed by this webinar is how to achieve a capable state, which has already begun from various angles. But the messiness lies in between interventions and translating them into societal impact. The bureaucratic capacity has been mentioned, and I think this is the one, together with revenue generations, are the 2 core capacities of government, with the focus on efficient use and distribution of resources together with service delivery. If we agree on administrative justice and equalization of opportunity as the outcomes of a capable state, then we can move in the same direction. Similarly, we know through our direct experience that we cannot have a capable state without it that is not ethical. The way in which citizens experience the rule of law and social justice influence levels of trust, as we saw in our data. Nation-building efforts are counter-effective when citizens are not treated equally in their interactions with government. Social inclusion at all levels are the outcomes of government intervention, but stability, before stability can be achieved. So these are the collective measures if we are able to track and analyze the capacities of the state through trust indicators. I think in the last one, I won't spend too much time on this aspect as my co-panelist will be talking to this, but a similar approach was used in the previous pathways to implement and understand how government is actually implementing all of its policies. But these pathways for the developmental state is for government to design, implement, and defend developmental objectives in line with capable and ethical states to overcome the triple challenges. Here we see the 6th administration has set out these interventions, and the DDM, the District Development Model, Economic Recovery Plan, the 4th Industrial Revolution, digitization, together with the Single Public Service and Spatial Transformation, all these are already in motion. So I'd like to end by saying that collective efforts are needed towards a change agenda, which is why this webinar is so important to bring together these different minds. This quote from the World Happiness Report of 2020 put trust at the center as we emerge from one stress after another. And I think these are the crises that we're trying to heal from. I'm going to stop there. Thank you. Thank you, Baba. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Harsha. Perfectly on time. So thank you very much. So Graham, take note of the example set by Harsha and the opening speaker. Graham will be, as mentioned, be speaking on social attitudes to governance in Gauteng. He's the Director of Research at the GCRO. His academic studies have been in political science at Wits University. Before joining the GCRO in July 2009, he worked as a research consultant on local government and urban development and on strategy development at the city of Joburg. His research interests are in the areas of city development and urban renewal, urban economic development, local government, government strategy, urban sustainability, intergovernmental relations, and state theory. And he has worked in all 6 iterations of the GCRO's Quality of Life Survey. Over to you, Graham. I don't think we can hear you, Graham.
I need to unmute. That happens so often,
Thank you.
and I'm really sorry about that. Okay, so thanks very, very much, Abba, and thanks, colleagues, for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm going to be doing a combination of two things, talking a little bit about the results from our recent Quality of Life survey, and then delving a tiny bit into how we begin to think about what the Quality of Life survey results show, and the results from the local elections. You can see here the Quality of Life survey, for those of you who don't know, is a survey that the GCO runs every 2 years, ever since 2009. And the last survey, which covered about 13,600 respondents.
Ram, can you take a moment and just change it to slideshow?
Is on slideshow. Have I ended up not doing the right thing?
Take your time.
Is that better?
There we go. Yeah, thank you.
I never know which is the screen I'm displaying.
I know.
Yeah, so basically, the Quality of Life survey, which ran from about October last year until May this year, gives us a really good sense of the mood on the ground during this extraordinary period that we've seen as the country was impacted by COVID. And this quote, which is one of many which we can draw from the Quality of Life survey, basically sums up, in a sense, some of what I'm going to talk about a little bit in terms of sliding satisfaction with government. So this is a slide that says that government, in fact, did try to come to the party to assist people in distress during the COVID period. 23% of all respondents say they or someone in their household received some kind of assistance in terms of the social relief or in distress grant. 13% received some kind of food support. And generally, people were satisfied with government's response to COVID by race. You can see this graph here, about 62% were satisfied with government's response to the COVID pandemic. But that's one of the few highlights, good notes in the survey. The rest of the story is pretty relentlessly downbeat, as you will see. As we conduct a survey, we ask very similar questions across the years. And this one asks about, do the respondents think that officials adhere to Bata Pele principles? And you can see here that the percentage saying no has increased from 52% to 70% this time round. Only 24% of respondents say they trust the current leaders of government. Only 17% agree that leaders from different parts of government in Gauteng work well together. And only 18% agree that leaders include most stakeholders in government decision making. We asked the question, do you agree or disagree that the country is going in the wrong direction? And over 62% said the country is going in the wrong direction. A lot of respondents signaled corruption as a concern. We asked the question, what is government doing the worst at? Of course, a large majority of respondents signal socioeconomic conditions. So 52% are saying job creation is the thing that government is doing the worst at. But 18% say keeping government free of corruption is what government is doing the worst at. And we also asked the question, what is the main reason people are living in poverty? Again, lack of jobs shines through. But 15% say corrupt or incompetent government officials, and that's a fair chunk of respondents. Now, these negative attitudes towards government have had a very serious impact on satisfaction with government. This is the national government picture over the years. Last time around, satisfaction with national government was at around 42%. This time around, it's dropped to 33%. Provincial government in Gauteng took the biggest knock. It had been increasing, largely, we think, because of the image of the premier as a reformer, as someone as a dynamic leader. It had increased to 44% in 2017-18, but dropped all the way back down 15 percentage points to 29% in the last Quality of Life survey. This is local government. It's always the lowest of the three spheres. Last time round, it was 37% satisfied with local government, and this time around it's dropped all the way down to 26%. Of course, it varies across the different municipalities, Some municipalities, there's been an increase in satisfaction. You can see here with Midvaal, but most municipalities, Ekurhuleni was increasing, dropped back down to 27% satisfied. Johannesburg was sort of increasing, not as much as Ekurhuleni, dropped all the way back down. Look at Mfuleni, this is the lowest of all the municipalities, a massive drop from 23% to 9% this time around. And we think that these various factors that I've highlighted have had some kind of impact on satisfaction with government. I'm just going to do one comparison. You'll remember that question a short while ago in terms of what people think the main reason is that people live in poverty. For those people who say corrupt or incompetent government officials is the main reason that people live in poverty, 20%, just 20% are satisfied with the Gauteng provincial government. For those giving any other reasons, job creation or lack of jobs or whatever, 31% are satisfied with provincial government. And what that's telling us is those people who are highlighting corruption as an issue are much less satisfied with the Gauteng provincial government. In the last 4 minutes or so that I've got, I'm going to just turn to look at some of our preliminary analysis of the local elections and then try and relate the quality of life surveys to some of those election results in a very, very tentative analysis. Now, this is a busy slide, I'm sorry, but I'm just going to highlight one or two things, if you don't mind. If you can look here in the right corner, this is the key takeaway from this from this table. In 2016, just over 3.6 million people cast votes. This time around, just 2.7 million people cast votes, which was a drop overall of about 1 million voters who went to the poll. Overall, the percentage turnout dropped 14 percentage points from 58% to 43%. And you can basically see how all the major parties, in one way or another, suffered losses. And I know there's a lot of talk at the moment about how the DA has won out in the metros and so on and so forth, but it is worth noting that the DA also suffered big losses during this election. ANC, the biggest loss, 680,000 votes, a drop in percentage share of 10.6. DA, almost 600,000, a drop in percentage share of 9 percentage points. Even the EFF lost votes over the 2016 local elections. And of course, the big winner here was Action SA. We've done some preliminary mapping. This is a map that we've called percentage missing votes per ward. And really, it's the inverse of a map of turnout. And you can basically see here that the ANC in particular was heavily affected by lower levels of turnout in its core areas. So this is Soweto, Orange Farm, the Kotoris townships, Tembisa, the Shoshanguve Mabopani complex up here. And you can see here, the deeper the color red, the higher the percentage of people who did not go to the polls. So that's a very, very serious picture for the ANC. We've done some preliminary mapping of each of the electoral, the main parties. This is a map you've got to sort of bear with me. This is Soweto over here, inner city of Johannesburg, and this is Alex over here. So basically, you're looking at a sweep from Soweto across the northern suburbs of Johannesburg. This is EFF, and you can see obviously 1 dot equals 20 votes. The predominance of the EFF in Soweto and township areas. The reverse picture for the DA, predominating in the northern suburbs of Johannesburg. The ANC in yellow here, much greater number of votes represented by the density of dots, again concentrating in the townships. And this remarkably is the Action SA. And what we're seeing here is that this is a political party that's come out of nowhere, but is capturing votes both in Soweto, the ANC's traditional heartland, and in the DA's traditional heartland of the northern suburbs. So a strangely multi-dimensional cross-race party. Now, we've done a little bit of work to begin to understand how these attitudes towards government translate or relate to the electoral results. And I'm going to talk very, very provisionally and very, very quickly. In 2017-18, we asked the question, if you were to vote tomorrow, what political party would you vote for? We don't think that's a result from the survey that can be used for polling purposes, but what it does give us a good sense of is for those respondents who definitively said ANC or DA or EFF, what is their social and political profile given the attitudes they expressed? And what you're seeing here, very interestingly, is yes, the EFF voters are slightly less satisfied with local government than ANC voters, but it's not that ANC voters are dissatisfied with local government. In fact, ironically, you're seeing a situation where DA respondents saying that vote DA are much more satisfied with local government than ANC voters. In this slide, we've done a little bit of a sleight of hand with the data to ask the question for all quality of life respondents in 2020-21, what was the ward party winner for where they were located? And it's as close as we can get to the political attitudes and so on of the individual respondents. I need to emphasize that we're not asking the question, what would you vote for here? We're assigning a ward party winner to the place where the respondent lives and then drawing some kind of correlation. Satisfaction with local government, again, you can see DA wards have much higher levels of satisfaction. This is a combination of all of the smaller parties, and you can see much lower levels of satisfaction in wards that went to these smaller opposition parties. This is another picture on the last two slides. The country is going in the wrong direction by the party respondent in 2017-18. You can see for those people who say EFF, that vote EFF, much higher levels of people agreeing the country is going in the wrong direction than for the other two parties. But interestingly here, those wards that went ANC as opposed to these wards that went to other parties, even here, ANC wards are saying the country is going in the wrong direction in the last quality of life survey. So in a nutshell, I'm going to end at that point. The quality of life survey gives lots of details about satisfaction, trust in government, the embeddedness of government in our communities, etc., etc., etc. And in a nutshell, we're seeing a very negative set of attitudes coming through, and that is applicable even in those areas that have traditionally been for the ANC. I'm going to end at that point. Sorry for the additional time.
It felt like 10 minutes to me, so that's fine. I think, we'll obviously need to unpack these figures, and I'm hoping that during discussion time, we'll have an opportunity to come back to this, and you could use flash some of your slides again when you're making your point, Graham. But let us proceed. We're doing pretty well for time. Just another round of recognitions. All the way from Germany, we are graced with Uta Dirksen, who's based here in Johannesburg now, and hopefully she can tell us about how the coalition is going in Berlin. We've got Kulikane Mate from the Banking Association South Africa. We've got Neil Coleman of the Institute of Economic Justice. I'm also glad to see Mbokiseni Buthelezi from Pari, and Monica Newton. Maybe you could shed some light on the discussion about how you've been meeting challenges at the local level where you are. Okay, so let us proceed to the next presentation, and that's by Nomzamo Zondo of SERI, who will be speaking on what did the July uprisings teach us about accountability. She's the executive director of SERI. She holds an LLB from WITS and served her article with the WITS Law Clinic. She joined SERI in February 2013 to work with exploited and marginalized communities using the law to balance the scales of social justice. She has litigated on behalf of unlawful occupiers, informal settlement dwellers, informal workers, and activists. And her practice of the law has highlighted the need to amplify community voices in public interest litigation through legal representation that supports and strengthens the agency of communities and movements. Nomzamo, looking forward to hearing what you've got to say about the July uprisings. Thank you.
so much, Abba. So unlike other speakers, I'm really not comfortable with PowerPoint, so everyone will just forgive me. So I'm really going to share on a project that Seri has been working on following what has happened after the July uprisings. And specifically, we are looking at what government's response was following the unrest. And we started this project at the end of July, soon after the government had announced that the government had arrested 3,964 people during the unrest. Over 2,000 of them had been in KZN, and just over 1,200 had been in Gauteng. And we felt it was important for us as an organization that acts in the public interest to follow how people are being treated in pretrial detention, and how specifically the state is ensuring that their constitutional rights are protected. And in the course of this project, of course, we understood that the uprisings or the unrest or the rebellion, whichever term that you are comfortable with, presents a key moment, a key political moment in South Africa, and really gave us a thermometer on social cohesion. And I'm sure if it would really tell you with the information that Graham is giving us now about what's really happening in the country, and as we've seen in the elections, again, it's clear that in the townships, in the informal settlements, there's real unhappiness around governance. And I want to start this by really just to contextualize, to speak about the project that we've done, the people that we have engaged with, and what has come out of the project. So firstly, we actually visited the courts that were processing detainees following the unrest in Alexandra, in Palm Ridge, in Vosloorus, in Protea, and again in Johannesburg Central. And in the process of doing what we called a watching brief, observing how the prosecution is acting, how the magistrates are acting, and also how even lawyers are engaging with these cases, we found some surprising outcomes. Firstly, a big majority of people that were arrested in those courts were youth. We found that almost all of them had been kept in pretrial detention for a minimum of 9 days, some much longer. And again, we found that there were very disturbing attitudes held by the magistracy and the prosecuting authority. I think it's very, very important to kind of think of, here we're talking about accountability, but also talking about a moment where the whole country was up in arms about the importance of the Constitution and how it binds all of us, how it binds former President Zuma, how it binds the police, how it binds the looters themselves. And so we felt it was important to kind of see, how has the Constitution touched this specific process? I think the arrests and the raids of people's homes were the two most visible actions taken by the state post the unrest. And in the process of doing this work, we met two separate cases that really made us worry about the currency of the Constitution in this country and really how it is lived within the criminal justice system. So firstly, we came across a young woman who is a Swati national who had been arrested inside her home on the 12th of July. And her arrest had happened because her neighbors who live in the same yard as her had participated in the unrest. She had not participated, but inside her room, the police found a packet of nappies. She was a mother of a 4-month-old baby at the time. She was arrested. Her family on the same day immediately approached the police and said, these nappies have been bought, here's the receipt. The police returned the nappies, but did not release this young woman. And we met her five weeks after she'd been arrested. She'd been detained and couldn't be released, because not only was there now an issue about the charge she was facing, but also she was someone who was undocumented. Her passport had expired just before the hard lockdown. And when we engaged with the NPA and we also engaged with the courts, we got a strong sense of how that there was a xenophobic sentiment to how she was being treated, but also that there wasn't really any due diligence being done in the placing of these matters before the courts. And thankfully, after we intervened, this lady was released. Almost a few weeks later, we met an even more harrowing story. It's the story of 3 young men who'd been arrested in Protea. they'd been arrested for the charge was that they had robbed an ATM. And the reason that they've been charged for robbing an ATM is that they were found with notes, I think, coming to about 200 Rand between the three of them, 20 Rand notes. And the police statement said they'd been chased from this ATM and arrested. What was concerning for us was that the NPA had then decided that these young men were not eligible for bail, except if there were exceptional circumstances permitting their release on bail. And when we inquired, we discovered that the NPA had scheduled the bail for these young men as a Schedule 6 offense, which is the same that you would, for instance, for a multiple rape, for murder, and we were of course surprised. And when we challenged the NPA stuck to their guns until we said, then please provide a certificate to prove that this scheduling is correct. And they relented, and then bail was set. But by that time, these young men had spent, I think, about 13 weeks in detention. And this said to us really that, one, we were worried then about the attitude taken by the NPA, but even more worried that the courts are in the hands of the magistrates, who in our understanding are judicial officers who have a responsibility to uphold the Constitution. And when we went back and checked in all of these cases, the first postponements were granted as a rubber stamp in all the courts. So regardless if you're an 18-year-old, if you're a mother, regardless of what you were arrested for, you were kept in pretrial detention for the minimum of a week. And the magistrates and the people who were in charge of the courts were not asking any questions. That for us felt like a weakness. In relation to the NPA, the attitude unfortunately was, we will make these people pay. And it really bothered us because we were sitting with events in July where we were telling former President Jacob Zuma to respect the Constitution. And it seemed that both the judiciary and the NPA were not willing to use a questionable lens in engaging these cases. Firstly, they were intentionally refusing these people their pre-trial, their right to be released before trial. And then secondly, even in relation to how much bail was being set, you could see that people's circumstances were not being taken into account. And again, this was a concern for us. But what all this information brought for us was, who is held accountable and for what? So the First Lady, who is such a national, the reason she's held accountable is because she lives in Katlehong. And because she's someone who lives in Katlehong, the police could raid not just the area closest to the mall, but her home, which is a section of a township. And because of that, she was arrested. The fact that she had not committed any offense did not stop her from spending 5 weeks in detention. Again, these young men, yes, the police version is we found them with this money, but they were not really being held accountable for the 200 they had with them. They were being held accountable for the whole unrest, or at the very least, they were being held accountable for bombing the ATM or for breaking the ATM, something that they clearly could not have done. And in understanding this, it really for us then meant actually when we speak as the public interest legal services sector about the Constitution, we always take for granted that South African support. But at that moment of the unrest, soon thereafter, in engaging about the raids and in engaging about these arrests, what became clear is that the Constitution is only accepted when it's convenient. The Constitution is only accepted when people support the outcomes that it calls for. And now we're sitting in a position where the unrest, as all of us now have to accept, was started by people who were supporting President Zuma. And we are having to go back to poor people to say, you must understand the Constitution demands that he is accountable. But at the same time, that Constitution could not protect them. That Constitution could not stop the NPA from violating their rights to release before trial. It could not stop the magistrates from completely ignoring what was happening in this post, to the extent that 3 young men, one of them who was in matric, had spent more than 2 months in detention. And sorry about that.
No, we can hear you, don't worry. You've got another couple of minutes.
Thank you, Abba. And so I think in really, so when the NPA and the Department of Justice started, I think when they presented to Parliament about these unrests and about the arrests during the unrest and how they intend to approach it, they were very clear. The articulation was, "We'll bring to book the most responsible." And they made promises that rights won't be violated. They made promises that everyone will be equal before the law. But what soon became clear is that in this large pool of people, over 3,000 of them, these were for them on their own articulation, the people that they were least interested in. But unfortunately, because many of them can't afford lawyers and many of them are sitting very far from public view, the state's power fell hard on them. And there wasn't really anything that they could do to protect themselves. Two, a concern that comes up as always is the fact that unfortunately, those who don't have power have to be accountable. You are accountable if you are responsible or not responsible, like the Swati National. You are accountable for more than what you are culpable for. But I really want to sort of close off by speaking about what does accountability say about responsibility. For everything that we know about the unrest, we have been told that the police and the intelligence had prior warning of what would happen, at least a week before. How did they act? We know they were unable, one, to contain any of the violence where it happened, but also most recently we've been hearing that they actually abandoned the South African public. And there's questions about their responsibility. Is there any responsibility on the part of the Ministry of Police? Is there any responsibility on the part of the Ministry of Intelligence? Should we be raising questions about the fact that we have not seen them account for that? In these circumstances, from what the poor have experienced, we've experienced that accountability comes quick and is swift. But the more powerful people are, that accountability is delayed. Of course, as we saw with former President Zuma, you are able to put someone else in between to deflect your own accountability. And for us as SERU, in putting together this project, we're kind of hoping to have data that we could engage the National Prosecuting Authority and especially the South African Human Rights Commission to kind of say, if we want to talk about a constitution that lives, if we want to talk about a constitutional vision that people can buy into, how do we make sure that it's experienced in the same way by people who are affluent and people who are poor? How do we make sure that, for instance, we address this situation where we are seeing people who are mostly poor losing, some of them having to plead guilty, and losing really even the small slither of hope that they have for changing their lives. Thank you so much, Abba.
Thank you. Thank you, Nomzamo. I think you've adequately and justifiably raised some really tough questions that I hope we could address and deal with in our discussions as well. So thank you very much. It gives me great pleasure to bring up the final member of the panel discussion, and that's my own colleague, who is Kwezi Mabaso. I think some of you may know him from his various iterations. He's worked at COSATU as the National Social Policy Coordinator. He's been Program Manager at the FES, the Frederick Ebert Stiftung, and a junior lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences. He obtained his MA in Political Science and Political Economy from Pretoria, University of Pretoria, and currently working on a PhD in Development Sociology at Wits University, especially focusing on a gendered analysis of South Africa's agrarian question. He is a fellow at the Atlantic Fellows for Racial Equity Program, hosted by the Nelson Mandela Foundation and Columbia University. He has published several book chapters and articles in peer-reviewed and popular publications. His work focuses on heterodox political economy, political sociology, and labor studies. He is the co-editor of Mistra's 2020 Beyond Entrepreneurship, Rethinking Black Business and Economic Empowerment. Kwezi, over to you on the local developmental state. What are the lessons from the past 27 years? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And I hope you can see the screen that I'm sharing.
For some reason, I can't. Is there something?
We can see it.
I can see.
Okay.
Oh,
great.
okay. No, that's fine.
Yeah. No,
Okay.
thank you, Chairperson. And I just also want to acknowledge the presence of various leaders from different social institutions in South Africa. And yeah, all protocol is observed. So in my presentation, I want to basically make two contributions to this discussion. The first one is that the efforts aimed at rebuilding the state have to address governance challenges with an appreciation of the intersecting relationship between both the political and administrative governance challenges and the socio-economic dimensions. In other words, the politics and socio-economic development within the context of the developmental state influence each other. And we particularly have to look at this relationship within the context of what I would call the political economy of the local state, because it is at the coalface of citizens' experiences of South Africa's post-apartheid democratic dispensation. And so I've contextualized the discussion within the context of the local developmental state. And just as a quick reminder, with regards to the concept of the developmental state, which features prominently in the nation's policy documents, there are three main attributes. The first one is what the late Professor Thandika Mkhandebule labels as a developmental state bureaucratic structure. And basically here, the literature speaks to the ability of the state to implement its policies efficiently and develop the capacity over time, including the human resources, to ensure that it attains its policy goals. Now, we know that there are contextual factors that influence the development of these types of bureaucracies in developmental states. The one was the political culture in the East Asian developmental states, which placed a primacy on public service. The second thing was the patriotic and nationalism, and also more importantly, the specific recruitment and training processes. The second aspect of a developmental state is what Evans referred to as embedded autonomy. Now, the state is embedded in the sense that it establishes key relationships with social partners in order to drive various development programs. And in the context of the East Asian developmental states, these relationships were mostly established with the emerging business class in that country. But of course, this embeddedness of these relationships must also be balanced by a level of autonomy, where the state is not captured by particular interests. So in other words, the state pursues collective national developmental goals and interests without being dominated by sectarian interests in society or politics. And then the last aspect, I think, of the developmental state is the emphasis on state coordination and economic restructuring. Now, developmental states aren't socialist states per se, but the state does play more of an interventionist role in terms of coordinating development to address market failures. And this takes many forms. The one is that the state establishes agencies to coordinate economic development and restructuring. Secondly, the state implements selective industrial policy and uses state rents to drive development towards a particular direction. And there's also the significant role of public enterprises in driving development. But the main point that I'm trying to basically highlight in summarizing these attributes of a developmental state is this relationship in governance between the political and administrative issues and socioeconomic development and how the two intersect. Now, what I want to do is that I want to now point to the key findings in two pieces of research or research reports that have been published by the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. that give us some idea on this intersection relationship between the political and the socio-economic dimensions within the context of the local states. So the first important research that I want to speak to is the book that we published in 2020 on rethinking Black business and Black economic empowerment. And the book basically assessed the socio-economic impact of BEE, but more importantly for this debate, it also examined the various experiences of entrepreneurs. And one of the additions or the contributions that the book made was to bring to the fore the experiences of entrepreneurs, especially Black entrepreneurs, outside of listed companies and who haven't been part of empowerment deals. And there were 2 chapters in the book that specifically focused on the experiences of Black entrepreneurs within the context of the local states. And the chapter focused on the experiences of both formal SMMEs and also informal sector entrepreneurs. And this is a summary of the main lessons, and I think they speak to some of the debates we're having around the developmental states, but I think they bring this debate to experiences within the local context. The first one is the disconnect between LED planning, BEE implementation, and overall SMME support. So, and I think those points highlights the poor coordination within the intergovernmental system, especially when it relates to the state's role in driving development. What the interviews revealed is that some of this of the LED planning didn't adequately factor in BEE. In some cases, some of the municipalities did not even have a coherent enterprise development strategy. The second, I think, major finding from this particular study relates to the structural impediments for informal economy entrepreneurs and non-wage livelihood practices. Now, the reason why we place an emphasis on also trying to bring to the fore the experiences of informal entrepreneurs is because we know that informality plays a huge role in the livelihood practices of citizens within the context of a local state, but also in a country that's characterized by systemic exclusion and barriers for both employment and business development. It's important again to focus on how do we leverage on the informal economy. And with regards to this, the major issues or the findings there was that the zoning and the bylaws continue to be to restrict the activities of informal entrepreneurs. But also there were issues related to the infrastructure plans within municipalities and how those infrastructure plans neglect the market access issues of informal entrepreneurs. And then the last point also there was also the context of entrepreneurship within informal entrepreneurship, within the context of the care economy and social reproduction. And so those were some of the major findings in relation to the informal economy and the entrepreneurs. Another significant point derived from this study was also the challenges with regards to the fiscal governance framework and the constraints for economic entrepreneurship and economic restructuring. Now, I can't go into all of them here, but I'll just want to highlight a couple of points here. The first one was that most formal and informal Black SMMEs cannot meet the procurement criteria within the context of the local state because of market structure barriers, information asymmetry, and some of the exclusionary tender specifications and requirements. The second thing in relation to the point about the fiscal governance framework was a weak alignment between procurement spend and efforts aimed at localized industrialization or building local value chains with an emphasis on local content. And this is important because one would hope that any attempts to build a Black business class within the local context is not just based on demographics, but also on producing other multiplier effects that go beyond just ownership, jobs, rebuilding the productive capacity within the context of the local state. The other important point that came out with regards to the fiscal governance framework was the funding model of the local states and the over-reliance on service and rates for revenue. And this produced a number of challenges from the sponsors that we got in those two chapters. The over-reliance on rates has led to several negative impacts. The first one is that some of these states don't have sufficient funding for LED. Secondly, the continuous rise of rates have a negative impact on demand and also on business costs. But the main point to be made around this fiscal governance framework is that, and within the context of LED, is that it needs to be reorientated towards more long-term planning in order to build the productive capacity within the local state and link it to some of the key spend. And then the last point is on the state's limited regulatory and administrative role in local economic development. What the findings illustrated here was that the view of the state's role in economic development within the local context was very limited. It was basically hinged, or it was basically premised, on the idea of the state performing conventional regulatory functions and just delivering services. Whereas there is a debate about enhancing the role of the state within the context of local economic development. And this debate raises important issues, such as developing localized state incentives and rents to restructure the productive base in local states, and possibly even using local-owned state entities to achieve various socio-economic objectives. The second study that I want to speak to, which highlights more of the political administrative dimensions, is a study on patronage. And this study basically looked at the different forms of patronage that develop across 5 municipalities in the country, based on extensive field work. And it looked at the intersecting relationship, again, between patronage and governance and socio-economic development.
I'm giving you 2 minutes.
Oh yes, yeah. But the main points and findings from the study were that state legitimacy and capacity is important for understanding patronage politics in local communities and how they develop and operate. So in other words, when you have state failure, it creates conducive conditions for patronage and people to go for external avenues for addressing these socio-economic development issues. The second point here is that the legitimacy of the state is based on both its administrative capacity to deliver services and adhere to rules, but also to address the key socio-economic demands within community. So if I was to put it in another way, I would say that there's a link again between both the socio-economic and political dimensions in state legitimacy. The last point that I want to make, because of time constraints, is that when we debate state capture, corruption, and its impact on development in the local state, we have to also locate it within the context of class formation, because there are other actors outside the state that influence the efficacy and the legitimacy of governance. Business groupings, both at the national and the local level. But also, secondly, when we debate this issue around patronage and state capture, we also need to be aware of the multi-class dimensional factor in regard to that debate. And here the point I'm making that it's not just poor people or poverty-stricken people who engage in these patronage networks and links, but it's also middle-class people who have social capital and networks. So there's a question then also about leadership, both within the state, but also with other key actors that engage the state on the local level. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Kwesi. I think largely everyone kept to their times. I know it's very provocative issues that have been raised and lots of new questions that have been asked. So I know there's a number of questions that have been raised in the chat. Also, if there's an indication, if there's anyone that would like to speak to some of the questions raised, please raise your hand. I see that a question to you, Kwesi, is how does long-term planning and coalitions work? I think obviously very relevant to our current post-local government election situation. David Allen's raising the question about cadre deployment and a capable state. So obviously, they'd like panelists' viewpoint on that. Then Jitendra Hargovin's raising questions around the political influences and how this impacts on social delivery. Let me see, are there any hands that anyone that would like to raise some questions? And if I'm missing anyone, let me know. Don't see any hands yet. Tsakiso, do you want to raise your question? Hey, Tsakiso. You can use the mic and the video.
There are two hands, Abba, Candice Morkel, and Jocelyn Bass.
Candice. Okay, let's go with Candice. Over to you, Candice.
Thank you so much, Abba, and thank you so much to the panelists. It's really excellent input. I almost didn't want to speak because what more can be said? I concur with so many of the things that have already been said. But perhaps Kwesi's research and his input on, and he mentioned very quickly embedded autonomy, and it made me think of the research that I did for my own PhD was actually on embedded autonomy between the state and non-profit organizations, specifically looking at developmental social welfare. And a lot of the things resonated very much in terms of, poor regulatory frameworks and regulatory environment. But I think fundamentally the degradation of the trust relationship between the state and NPOs was one of the major findings of this research. And it's almost to the point where it has been so completely eroded that there are some non-state actors who actually feel that there is no other way. And I think we've seen it in some, NPOs going to the Constitutional Court to get some remedy for some of the rights that have, been, not been met or covered by the Department of Social Development. So my question is, to what extent, when we're talking about embedded autonomy, are we talking about the state's prioritization of its relationship with the private sector? Because if we look at developmental state theory as well, it's talking about economic growth. And I think one of the questions in the chat was about whether we could actually mimic East Asian tigers with the industrial-led growth. And even if you look at the finance minister's speech as well, the focus is on fast growth, fast-growing economy. But also one of the fundamental factors that Harsha spoke to was that this relationship between trust and GDP is also important. So if we have the state focusing, on prioritizing its relationship with specifically the private sector, to what extent if we are neglecting the relationship with other non-state actors? And Peter Evans speaks about having a broad collective of non-state actors with whom the state needs to have a relationship. If we're ignoring such a fundamental, non-state actor that needs to co-produce these public goods with the state, to what extent can we actually achieve a developmental state? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ms. Morkel. Let me have Herman Funk, and then there's Jocelyn Bass after you. Herman?
Thank you very much. Even though I enjoyed the high quality input of the various presentations, and I've been an attendee of all 3 seminars you ran, however, I'm slightly confused because the emphasis is on rebuilding. And what we hear and what we see is just a further kind of evaluation of what is wrong, and not enough emphasis, in my personal opinion, on what to do in order to really rebuild South Africa. Because let's face it, carrying on is not a choice if we want to have a functioning country. And not only the seminar, but every newspaper you open, we focus on all the wrongs in this country. I think it's about time that we shift gear and focus on how to correct the wrongs. They have been identified. We don't need further discussions, but what we need is now to develop a way forward constructively and getting the population involved. The biggest fear I have for this country is that millions of people live in a state of hopelessness. If we don't change our conversation, we will not contribute for them or to ever see a clearer and a more positive picture. And I think this is where the shift needs to take place. That's my personal opinion from what it is worth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate your inputs. And I also noted your consistent attendance at these webinars. So thank you very much for your support. Very important question you're raising. How do we take it forward? How do we rebuild? Are important questions. Jocelyn, Bas?
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. My comment and question is aimed at Mr. Netshitenzi. I appreciate his, what I would call old school intellectual approach to things. But I was rather disappointed, I must admit, that he raised a lot of questions around wasted opportunities. The hope of post-2017 was that wasted, but he never really gave a direction as to what he thinks the answers is, or the answers are. And I mean, I come from the 80s, and quite frankly, the July, whatever you want to call it, uprising, unrest, theft, looting, was for me an eye-opener. And in the old Marxian tradition, for me, that was just an indication that we finally have arrived at a lumpen proletariat. We've lumpenized people. They no longer are in possession of a class. They're no longer connected to society. You had young women walking around with their children in a pram or in a trolley, going into the shop and doing what is normally regarded as theft. And they were doing it so openly, without feeling threatened by the forces of the police, rest of the state, etc., etc. So to me, that was what I would call lumpenization. We finally have ordinary people joining the classes of criminality. And that's not because they were stealing things. That's not was because they were dispossessing what is normally regarded as private property. But it's because they felt dispossessed. They were acting in such a way that they are dispossessed and therefore do not feel that they need to go through the normal processes of having an education. Probably most of them have that, the certificate, trying to find a job, finding a job, earning money, saving for furniture, their housing, etc., etc. They were no longer in that process of development. So for Mr. Netshitenzi, having come through, the liberation struggle, is the question not that, yes, the last decade has been quite definitely a wasted opportunity. So we have made people into something that is going to threaten the entire state. And I was very happy that he talked about the state instead of just government, because government is really just a tiny bit of what the apparatus is really like. And so for me, it's about the discussion of the kinds of people that we are creating, the citizens that we are creating as a result of not just dysfunctionality, because it's not just dysfunctionality. There is an intentional approach to this in terms of the bureaucracy, in terms of the corruption that is happening, that has become quite systemic and endemic. For me, the biggest example of that was the allocation of funding towards the PPE interventions, that even in the face of death of our citizen about to die, we were still having citizens and institutions that were allowing for theft and dispossession. So for me, that is really what the discussion is about. There's going to be no reform of state structures. It has to do with, at this point in time, where South Africa sits as a society, how we restructure and how people organize. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Jocelyn. One or two colleagues have indicated they're having difficulty raising their hand. So TK, if you're ready, you can speak now.
All right, thank you very much, Abba, and thank you for, I think, also for the presentations. I'll try to be quick, because I did also post my question there. Mine is, I think it's touching on the theme, not the previous speaker, but the other one spoke about, which is the conceptualization of the rebuilding of government. And if we were to be serious about this, I mean, look, we have to be realistic about where we are. And my question is to the panel is, if we're being realistic about this, should we not maybe take a few burdens off the state? And the state, I am speaking about government. If you read the Constitution, and even if you look at the government apparatus of South Africa, my argument has always been that there's too many social pressures placed on government to do, and obviously that has to do with our history more than anything else. And I think one of the things we need to coalesce around, I think one thing we should really ask of the government is the question of economic development, because I think that's what we can first and front and center ask our government really to be clear about. And if that's the case, and that's the reason that rebuilding government needs to coalesce around an idea, and I think economic development is a right one. Now, there's many different ways to think about it, and I'd like to hear the panel discussion on it. But one of the things I think, if we're being serious, saying if we're rebuilding government, should maybe not one of the aims and things we look at is the apparatus of government, and I'll be more specific, provincial government in relation to local government. I am one of those believers that I think it's about time we really need to, I wouldn't say get rid of provincial government, but I think recast what we understand by provincial government. If provincial government is to be recast for the purposes of allowing economic development to happen, one of the things I put forward to is a huge reduction in its in how much we put money towards it, and also what we do with it. I think it should simply be an apparatus where we put bureaucrats to make monitoring and evaluation updates for us. And that money and those resources needs to go towards local government. And even within local government, if we're serious about economic development and rebuilding government, we need to rethink, why do we need 238 municipalities? I know there's this district development model, which if you read I think it's the 1998 white paper on local government, it's a recast of that more than anything else. Why should Gauteng, honestly, Gauteng should only have 2 local governments. It's small enough to do that. And then when you look at rural municipalities, why do we have so many districts there? So my question, to be more direct, is if we're serious about rebuilding government, should we not take some of the social pressures of government, which is to say, you need to be a provider of X, you need to be a provider of Y. Your only provision going forward in the next 10 or 20 years should be get the economic development agenda correct, and then make sure that government mimics what this agenda looks like. And one of the examples I'm putting forward is to say provincial government. Let's do away with that apparatus and structure. Thanks, Abba.
Thank you very much, TK. There's a couple other names that I'd like to call upon. One is Dr. Rob Moore, if you don't mind, maybe showing us your face and raising the question that you have raised in the chat room. And now you can talk.
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm just trying to get the video to go, but it won't. Thanks very much. It kind of strikes me that there are, and this is not a solution, but going back to our analysis of what's brought us to this point, and that is that there are a number of systemic things that are operating in the economy, and that's already been mentioned around the overly concentrated economy that provides little opportunity for entrance for new, in particular, Black businessmen, but in particular the drivers of corruption and how that has unfolded. And it strikes me that one of the powerful engines driving that is the need for political parties to be generating funds for themselves, and the obligation that then becomes distributed amongst party members, particularly party members who are put into positions of responsibility of one kind or another at any of the three levels of government. Is kind of automatically an incentive to inappropriate decision making with tenders, etc. And kind of what has come with that has been, if you like, the informal license for sort of personal rent seeking. And so I think it would be really useful for us to look at how political parties are funded and what they're allowed to do, and the kinds of scrutiny that is given to that, and how that particular imperative plays out. And this is not only the ANC. We've seen documented evidence of this in other political parties as well. So that's just the one thought that I thought would be worth including in this discussion. Thank you very much. It's been an outstanding seminar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob. A couple of other names that I want to call up. One is Sinitemba Matiwani. I think you've made some interesting points in the chat. And then Jitendra Hargovan after that, if you don't mind. Y'all are making some good inputs in the chat. So Sinitemba, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, no, thank you. I'm not going to put on my video. Yeah, but I'd just like to put this input. I was a ward councillor in Benoni from 2016 until 2021. So I didn't put up my name for ward councillor again. I'm now a PR councillor. But my biggest headache was the small businesses. They are so organized. They check the IDPs, they check the budgets, what is allocated to which wards. They group themselves in these small mafia groups. When the project, you call public meetings, you inform the public, you tell people, come submit your profiles to the CLOs, then whoever meets the criteria will get the work. As soon as the work starts, then 4 or 5 different groupings come, each demanding a slice. Others want protection, money, others want fronting. You find out they say I can do the job. When they get the work, then a company from Pretoria come and do the work. And then you ask, but you ask for an opportunity, but you bring a company from Pretoria. Then the person says, no, I have the right to do what I want. And then some hire foreigners. Then you say, but you are crying for local opportunities, but you hire foreigners because to do the job so that you can make profit. So this is the things that discourage me as a ward council. So I said, no, I can't. And every time it's police intervention. People come, they want to put in fiber, they stop the fiber companies. No, we want a slice of the cake. Then the fiber company says, but we are doing this on our own budget because once we are successful, then we get paid. So we're not doing this according to government. Then people say, no, government, they quote treasury. And then I say, but there's no such act for private. It's for government only, but it was a headache. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And that's what I've been liking about these webinars, that we've been getting some really good on-the-ground experiences and treatment or discussions. Jits, over to you. And then Adi Enthoven, if you don't mind, I'll call on you after Jits, and then we'll allow the panelists to respond. Jitendra,
Hi,
how
I hope you can, I hope you can hear me, Abba.
Clearly, thank you.
Okay, so I think the issue really is that, I mean, state has spent hundreds of millions, if not billions, on capacity building, on training, etc. But the officials being trained end up going back into the exact same environment within which they have to work. So the overall institution within which things have to be done is not functioning. And I think, I mean, I share the comments earlier. We're focusing on the past, we're focusing on the issues, and the panel should be looking at what are we talking from a capability point of view, like the previous speaker just said. I mean, the kind of nepotism, the hands in all the pies kind of thing, the political influences on decision making, including procurement, for example. So it's fine that you're trying to train people, but if you go back into an environment where things just don't work, how do we cater for that? And the DDM hasn't really taken off. I mean, it is a kind of cocktail rehashing and rehashing old kind of stuff, whether it's back to basics, it's municipalities in distress, whatever it is. And I'm trying to find, how do we build genuine capability, institutional, systemic, procedures, processes, all of that collectively to deliver services. Thanks.
Thanks, Jets. Adi, would you like to bring in the business perspective here?
Thanks, Abba. No, so I mean, I just want to touch on this point that's kind of come up a few times about building back, because I think this is absolutely critical. And both with my experience in the Solidarity Fund and in business, I think we have to recognize a very severe crisis in the state of the capacity, the absence of capacity in the state. And it's not everywhere. I mean, there are lots of places where you have, high levels of capability and capacity, but it's very uneven. And you see, huge levels of instability at senior levels in the state. I mean, with the Solidarity Fund, we're now working with our third DG since the start of this crisis. And this is in, the largest health crisis we've experienced in 100 years. And huge instability below the DG level. Now you can't deliver services. You can't do, place any expectations on the state when you have that level of instability at the most senior levels of the civil service. The number of acting DGs, of vacancies in senior level positions in the civil service. So not only was there kind of hollowing out of the state during the state capture years, but I think we've had this perpetuation of real weaknesses in the way that the state is organized. And what's increasingly clear, certainly to me, from the perspective of the fund, but also from the perspective of business, is that discussions where expectations are placed on the state are almost, interesting, but quite academic. All these kind of different plans for the economy and accelerating reforms, and they all require a certain level of functionality on the part of the state. And obviously, as you go down, you face greater and greater problems. At the local level, you find, not quite universal, but high levels of dysfunctionality across the country. So I just think, and I suppose at the session today, I was kind of hoping for a bit more focus and substance around, some of the questions about what is it going to take to rebuild the state.
I think that's a very important reminder of what we were trying to do. So I appreciate that. Adi, are you finished, Adi?
Yeah, sorry, I'm finished, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's no problem. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Monica to make her point, Monica Newton. Then I'm going to ask the panelists in reverse order, because Kwesi, there's quite a few questions directed at you, and then Namzamo, and then Graham, and then Harsha, and then I'll ask Joel to say a few words. And then if we have any more questions after that, we'll still have another round before we have some concluding remarks. So Monica Newton.
Thank you very much. And I'm known for some fairly plain speaking, which I'll probably regret. But my experience in the senior public service was largely about being spoken about and not to, in terms of the context of my working life, what my day looked like, what I was facing as priorities and choices at any given time. And I've said this before, but it's quite literally like being sent into a gun battle with a chocolate biscuit. And once you've run out of biscuits, you're just in a sustained armed conflict with absolutely no protection whatsoever, because you've run out of the transactional resources at your disposal. You've offered as much as you can in terms of budget, you've moved things around, you've zigged while somebody zagged in order to meet a political priority of one description or another. But probably the most important thing in my experience, and it certainly doesn't necessarily mean that this is a universal experience, but your average senior civil servant is facing so much accountability for poor policy agendas and decisions that it is not responsible for, that it is almost paralyzed. Ask yourself how often the term "but the AG says" comes up in a conversation about why one can or cannot do something. So we've really got ourselves into a situation, I think, where those that should be the most empowered to implement on behalf of a cohesive and coherent policy agenda are the least able to, for a variety of different reasons. And what I would really encourage is further engagement with the point that Kwesi raised about the question of patronage, but also, and this is going to be very difficult, but actually talking to the senior public service about why things don't work and how we can learn those kinds of lessons. Because while I understand that the impetus is for change and it must change, I feel as though we may be rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. And I'm glad you raised your head above the parapet. So let me start with Kwesi. There's a number of issues that have been raised there, and you can address them as you wish. And then I'll call on Nomzamo after that. Kwesi, over to you.
Thanks, Abba. The first question that was raised to me was a question around embedded autonomy. So yes, Candace, of course, I think it would be impractical to want to just mimic the embedded autonomy that was experienced in the East Asian developmental states in South Africa. But there is a case, I think, to be made about having embedded autonomy or state and society relationships within the context of a democratic South Africa. And that would not only include establishing relationships with just emerging entrepreneurs, but other important social groups within the context of the local state to drive development. And I know some people have even argued about the idea of developing localized social compacts. And the question of trust, of course, trust is always eroded within the context of developing these relations. When the state doesn't stick to policy prescripts and legislation, or when it fails to deliver on key developmental goals. Then the second question on rebuilding. So my emphasis in this presentation has been on the idea that we need to rebuild local economies. And the reason why I'm emphasizing that is that the economic inequality, the poverty that we see within the local state has a direct influence then on state capacity and capabilities, because the state becomes a primary source of accumulation, a primary source of contestation, and the only avenue for people to develop themselves. So we're not going to get the question right around rebuilding the state if we don't do it in connection within resolving the socio-economic issues. And then I've highlighted different ways of doing it to address economic exclusion. I think there was another question raised around the behavior of small entrepreneurs within the local context and how that affect governance. So I think, everyone agrees that we should not condone or support corruption, but there are challenges and behaviors that small entrepreneurs undertake that are related to deeper structural factors of exclusion within markets and not just corruption. So I'll give you a typical example, the debate around pricing and small entrepreneurs. Pricing is not just a product of collusion or corrupt collusion. It's also related to market access that's built into pricing and pricing mechanisms. So we need to address those structural issues while we also address corruption. And then the last one, again, just on the point of patronage, one of the solutions to decrease patronage within the local state that comes from the book is the idea of changing the political culture and political party dynamics. Because what came out in the study is that the adverse or the negative trends of accountability, patronage within political parties spill over onto the local state. And then the second one is building citizen capacity to hold leaders accountable. Yeah. So, but those are, I think, the questions that I picked up that I addressed.
Okay, and I think there's a question about the coalitions and the capable state. Any comments on that?
Yeah, well, from
long-term planning.
Yeah, well, from the experience of the past couple of years with coalitions, it's clear that coalitions or the political culture of South Africa isn't really hasn't developed coalitions that produce positive outcomes for local development and governance. And I think this even comes out in Mistra's published book on coalitions. But secondly, the other problem tied to that is that one is not clear about the clear policy or what is it, areas of convergence around policy with these coalitions. And so you can't talk about long-term planning and the effects and the benefits of that within that particular context because of what's happened with coalitions in South Africa.
Thanks, Kwesi. Nomzamo, over to you.
So I think, I heard Herman's question or challenge to say we must come up with solutions. But I think the reality is that when you engage with officials at all levels, there is a sort of amnesia, a sense that there is a lack of understanding of where we are as a country and where the poor are specifically. And I would be interested to hear if people have ideas on how to engage those government officials so they understand what the true picture is. So I think for me, in coming to that point, what's important is really how do we get government to show some commitment towards the constitutional vision? Because that's the one place, the last time that we negotiated who we want to do and what we want to accomplish. And unfortunately, at this point, we're in a point where the attitude of officials and sometimes politicians is generally anti-poor, in a country that has unimaginable inequality. And the reality, unfortunately, for most people is that corruption then becomes the only solution. So if we look at the issue of corruption hasn't just only spread in local government. You look at what's happening with transportation, with Uber, with Bolt. The amount of criminality that now goes to people who want to control where people's money goes to because people feel excluded. And therefore, as long as government insists on or continues on focusing on patronage as the way that they build a black capitalist class or provide some business towards the black majority, we're going to continue to see practices that are really move closer and closer to criminality rather than really people participating in the economy. I think that's just the last thing that I wanted to say is when the unrest hit, the first time the president spoke to the country, there was this idea that there could be social dialogue. at that time, he made a commitment to the possibility of a basic income guarantee. But we've seen that there's been a clear retraction of that commitment, which that means again we lose the issue of trust, that commitments are made, commitments are then not carried out. Of course, I accept that, Herman. Commitments are made and they're not carried out. And how do we then get government to actually build the trust of people by acting? And the only way we can do so is, of course, by engaging them primarily. But I think in relation to the unrest, it was a missed opportunity of making sure that everyone in the country can go back to what are we trying to build? What is the collective vision? And even accepting that we have so many challenges and now what we are going to do to address those challenges. Thanks, Abba.
Thanks, Nomzamo. Graham, over to you.
Thanks, Abba, and thanks very much to everyone for the really important provocations. Maybe I should just start by saying that GISO is a strange institution that is 1 foot in academy and 1 foot in the world of policy, and we try not to bifurcate the way we look at the world, but we try rather to say that one has to be in both places at once. So it's not just about let's stop navel gazing, identifying the problems, and get into the world of policy solutions. Rather, I think the arrival at policy solutions must circuit through a really, really careful reading of what the problem is. If you can correctly read the problem, you're closer to those policy solutions. So yeah, following Monica, I also have a reputation of engaging fairly robustly, so forgive me for any comments that might come across as a little abrasive. I think we're talking as a forum about 3 different things. This is my reading, my academic reading. On the one hand, we're talking about institutional restructuring, the need for institutional restructuring, and I heard TK, I saw Mbongaseni enthusiastically support his reading of the thing, but I'm going to make the point that I don't think institutional restructuring is what's the challenge here or the solution. You know, any institutional restructuring is in the short to medium term not an enabler of more capability. It takes away from capability. All the light, all the energy falls on the reconfiguration process, and in particular where HR resources already in place are likely to end up getting positions in terms of an institutional reconfiguration. You can literally change the diagram of an institution at the stroke of a McKinsey consultant's pen. But it takes years to implement and even more years to resettle an institution after that implementation. So this notion that the solution to the problem is to change the configuration of local government in Gauteng into 2 municipalities, because then their geographic size would be equivalent to what you might see in the literally depopulated Northern Cape, I don't think is a solution to the problems. Okay, the reading of the problem that's coming through from the discussion is the nature of what Chippy Olver calls the rent-seeking regime. And there's others who are much better placed at reading this. I mean, I think there's no question that we've been hollowed out by this over the last 10 years. And the only way in which we're going to make serious progress on this is to put more people in jail. Chippy and I have had this debate over time. It's a matter of emphasis. I would argue that the reading of the rent-seeking regime is probably less important than a set of apparently more prosaic questions of the working cultures and norms in the everyday operation of government. Now, let me just take a step back and say, when the transition started, I was involved in the process of writing white papers and so on. We had these starry-eyed notions of intellectuals being inserted into the state, almost like philosopher kings. Who would be able to see so much more clearly than the bureaucrats of old about what needed to be done. And I think over the last 20 years, we've seen the relentless march, not of lack of capacity, but the encroachment of fear. So the relentless march of what could be called an inferiority complex, a culture that can only be thought about as an endemic fear of failure. Rob and I were doing some research on provincial government's response to COVID last year, and we saw this time and time again. It's a fear of failure that's causing an increased separation between government and residents, that embedded part of the embedded autonomy thing. There's terror of the citizen, terror of the AG and the SIU, terror of the MEC, terror of the official in the room next door whose factional politics you're just not really able to read, who may be a faction all unto themselves, but nonetheless you're terrified of them. And I think the solution to that problem of officials in the bureaucracy with norms, with cultural practices that aren't able to get anything done because they're too scared, is to start small and try to do something. We were working with provincial government last year just to try to get more data on COVID spread out into the world against an environment which said, you can't put out more data. That's going to expose us. You can't put out more data. The Papier Act is going to come and bite us, etc., etc. Just little things about putting up websites which show what's going on in the world reestablishes trust of citizens, that government itself knows what's going on and has the citizens' best interest at heart. So what I'm appealing for is, let's try and break through that relentless inferiority complex, that culture of fear that's holding us back, by starting small and building from there.
Great. Thanks, Graham. That's very useful. Harsha, over to you. Quite a few people commenting in the chat also about trust. I see Candace Mockle has just put on something about a state's consultation between with the civil society has been perfunctory. If you have to build trust, the historical dividends, which we need to address that. So over to you. I think there's a number of issues you can pick and comment on. Harsha?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Abba. And certainly a very robust discussion. I think that, just drawing from what Graham has just said in terms of the culture of the bureaucracy, I wanted to actually go way up and then come to the bureaucracy itself. And I really appreciate both Herman and Jocelyn bringing us back to the order of the day to say that this was about rebuilding government. And I'd like to make that distinction, that state institutions and government being one of the state institutions. And there's a lot at stake in terms of how we already have, through our constitution, the checks and balances of the three arms.
Harsha, you're frozen up.
The state planning perspective. I want to can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, you froze up for a second there, but now you're okay. Do go on.
I see my internet connection is a little bit down, so that let me just keep the video off. Okay, apologies for that. So I think just coming back to the discussion on the developmental state, and happy to see that Kwesi and the work that has been done by Mistra, because within DPME, we have been doing work behind the scenes on the developmental state. And I think it's very clear that in those early 90s and post-Cold War, the developmental state took on a very economic stance in terms of industrialization, industrial policy. But when you start digging out more literature and more information, and we had the pleasure of actually hosting the Korean ambassador at the time, it was very clear that much more was written around the economic policies that drove developmental states to achieve so much in the Asian countries, but not so much of a focus on social policy. And what I mean by that is, when it's linked very closely to long-term planning and what is the competitive edge of a country, we clearly see that when we are having human resources, to build on human resources, to say that collectively our entire education system, health system will focus on building a human capability, as in the maths and science outcomes, for example, which is what led to the birth of Samsung in Korea. Now we see that today, but there was a whole thrust and a whole emphasis on investing in the human capability behind the scenes in terms of the economic policy. So I think that sometimes gets lost, and I think this is where it's sad to see our more human development index or indicators show the decline, not only from GDP perspective, but again, the developmental state work and the embedded autonomy issue. It's both. It's a kind of a catch-22, because basically the embedded autonomy brought out a very clear relationship between elites who had contributed to developmental objectives. But in our case, elites kind of went in the opposite direction. And I think rent-seeking, patronage, everything has been spoken to already. But there was two instruments that by which embedded autonomy is supposed to have worked. One is through decentralization, and the other one is collaborative partnerships and meaningful engagement through state-society relations. Now, decentralization, I think I'm not going to go on TK's, in terms of his recommendations around the provincial level issues, but clearly implementation and taking government closer to the people was one of the decentralization instruments that we did adhere to in terms of new public management. But again, we need to be able to see how this had played out over this last 25 years of our democracy. But I think, again, I want to come back to this difference between government and other state institutions. And I think that Monica has clearly set it out. There's a lot of senior public servants here in the seminar today. And I think this is something we all are grappling with in terms of how and what do we as public servants use to defend, to implement, to review, to say something is not working in government and take it forward. When you see that, and Annette is here as well, in terms of long-term planning, the instruments that we were using between national, provincial, and local, how disparate the instruments were, but there are, clear engagements of alignment and coherence. And I think the word integration and capability seems to be synonymous, because we are, as government, and this embedded autonomy in terms of the other side of the sword, is to say that, we're a product of society as well, where you see management starting to break issues and dealing with challenges and conflicts in piecemeal approaches. We see that happening not just in academia, but in society and in government, where issues are taken in siloed ways to be able to manage them. But at the same time, the integration doesn't happen to be able to see what the trade-offs were, what the spillovers were. What I'm getting to is senior public officials being able to take up this baton of analyzing and showing up where we see programs are not working or interventions not working. And this is where the disempowered part of the public sector capacity is actually not just visible, but is experienced in all these different, problems of how protests such as happening widespread as well. But I think if you think about trust being a long-term investment, but an event like the riots can just break it overnight. We see government as this, so somebody had put it up as a Titanic as well, but as a big ship. And how do you change course of a big ship that's going in a certain direction, so path dependent, yet, with any operational side that has to go through its different checks and balances, can actually still be agile as well. We've seen that in COVID. We've seen that decisions can be made in real time and implemented. Yet in other instances, in more normal circumstances, decisions take 4 or 5 years to be implemented. So there is that contrasting approach. But I think the one aspect that I'd like to bring out, Chair, and this is where we also done a lot of work on the political administrative interface issue. Chapter 13 of the NDP is very clear, or was very clear in its diagnostic. And that diagnostic was zooming straight into what the problems were. And the problems were that in the 1994 and the first 10 years of our democracy, when we were transitioning into trying to build a functional bureaucracy, it was very clear that in breaking from an apartheid past, we had to have ministers give some, say in who they were bringing up as senior public officials. But that was a clause just in the transition. Unfortunately, we still stay with the clause today, and that means that we need to actually amend the Public Service Administration Act to say that that is not needed anymore, where administrative functioning and the turnover of the senior public officials needs to be actually, remedied by the fact that the head of the public service is needed there. And I think that was a question already posed in the previous administration, and now it's being tackled. But the problem of turnover doesn't stay at the DG level or the DDG level. Senior public officials, starting from the director and chief directors, are beginning to see that their decision-making powers and even what is within their mandate cannot take up and deal with what is already being done in terms of in the same light as what was being said by Graham, this fear of compliancy, the AG's heavy hand coming on is a compliancy driven rather than improving and learning of lessons as we move along and being able to pick up the pieces as we've made the mistakes, but also to be able to build back. Now, I think building back seems to be another controversial one. Is it, do we build back where we came from, or do we build in something new? So that, let me end there. There's a lot that did come out, but I think the emphasis on rebuilding and moving forward rather than regurgitating a lot of what has been the issues and the problems and the challenges, that would be very constructive. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Harsha. Joel, before you make your closing remarks, there's quite a few comments that I just want to have aired, so I'm going to take any of them on. I think one by Neil Coleman, sorry, Neil. By Neil Coleman is that, isn't there an urgent need for overhaul and simplification of these regulations? And then I think Mogisani Buthelezi has been making the point about some of the work that is being done through the National School of Government. But we also need to think about what our aspirations should be while thinking about how to build in the short term better day-to-day process in every office. Then Frans van der Walt has been very active in the chat as well, talking about risk to invest that justifies the investment needs to be addressed. And then there's the question of the reforms of the Chinese government and places like Germany and Singapore that TK has made. He makes a point that our government has not had such a review post 1994. Barry Morkel speaks about real issues. Agency in the system remains critical. And then I think we go from Mark to Mintzberg. Thanks, Herman, for the reference to rebalancing society. I always find Henry Mintzberg an interesting book as well. And Graham's, some of your responses to that. Annette, thank you very much for the input around the DPME has developed a policy framework for integrated planning and related systems, which is aimed at addressing the fragmentation in planning. Embedded state comes in again, predatory states and so forth. Mutual trust and respect is being raised over and over again. So Joel, maybe if you want to reflect on that or any other issues, I see, sorry, before you go, I see there's one or two people that have indicated they would like to make a comment. I see Faisal Mayer's hand is up. And then Lisa Seftel, if you don't mind making your comments now as well, please. Faisal, over to you first.
Thanks, Eba. I think there's no doubt that rebuilding is complex, multidimensional, requiring a huge number of different kind of approaches, and there's no silver bullet. I think that's coming through very, very clearly. I just want to table the possibility of using digitization as something in a different kind of areas, not as a silver bullet, but certainly in any, whether they just be on just service delivery or whether it be on skills. There are some opportunities there. So I just want to make that contribution, Chair. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Lisa?
Thanks, Abba. I think to some extent what I want to say has also been raised in the chat and by Graham, but maybe just to say three things. I think, the first thing that I think we need to acknowledge is how broken and bad the state is at the moment. It's hard to do it because many of us have put a lot of energy into building the state, but I think the example that Siri talked about, and if we reflect back about what happened in those 8 days in July, I think we must say that the state and the relationship between the state and the people is very broken. And, I think we saw it in the statistics on the trust, we saw it in the election results. And I think most seriously, we're seeing it in the fact that people are not vaccinating without an explicable reason, that they don't trust the government enough in what it says, that if you vaccinate, we may not get a fourth wave and we might rebuild the economy. So we're almost like in a downward spiral, which is quite serious. The second thing that we need to have a more comprehensive, I think, understanding about is why. So there have been people who've posited certain things. Yes, rent seeking has been a problem. But I think, as Graham says, I don't think it's the only problem. A culture of fear and it's also, maybe part of the problem. A fear of failure. Yes, I agree. But I think we do need to look harder at what went wrong, what enabled. Is it, as I think Rob was talking about the relationship between the party and the state? We do need to look at that a bit harder, and maybe you'll do that as you go forward in your paper. And, I'm not a fan of this notion of embedded autonomy, because I think it incorporates a million of sins between social compacting, which is maybe regarded as good, and rent-seeking and collusive behavior, which we regarded as bad, if not even mafia-type relationships between the state and the private sector. And then the third issue I want to say is then, once we understand why, what is it that has to be done? And again, I think I agree with Graham, it is beyond organizational structure, but I think the points made by Mongenseni and others is that it can help. But then it's, I think a bit as Joel said, it's not tinkering around and having lots of consultants. It's about making very decisive decisions. And I think somebody talked about, I don't think it is, but is it about getting rid of a provincial sphere of government? But it does require some decisive, something that can maybe shake and things, even though, yes, it will be disruptive. Yes, it is about organizational culture. But lastly, and it maybe talks a little bit to what Monica was saying, it's about having leadership that will back their staff, that will have their back. And that is something, and then maybe it goes all the way back to, the reasons why. That's something that we are sorely lacking. Risk-taking, decisive leadership within the public service. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I think I've covered everybody that's been making their points. If there aren't any more hands, if my colleagues on this project can help me, are there any more hands coming up? If there isn't, I can call upon Joel to make his concluding remarks. and then Rashida after that. Joel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Abba. I won't make concluding remarks, but just respond to a few issues that have been raised. 3 of them, do we have a way forward? Secondly, the so-called lumpen proletariat, and thirdly, issues of state regulation. I'll use the old school methodology because I think it works. What needs to happen going forward, rather than merely diagnosing the challenges that we face? I would say that's precisely why in my input I was talking about realizing the objectives that are contained in the National Development Plan, the need to implement the Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, and of course the need for the various social partners to work together in the form of social compacting, business, labor, civil society, the union movement, and so on. And in the context of social compacting, I wish to underline what one of the speakers said, that we need an ultimate ideal, which would describe what is contained in the injunctions of the Constitution. And in my view, as I've said on other platforms, this would entail a kind of developmental state with very high rates of economic growth, combined with social democracy, with also high levels of social redistribution. You need a combination of the two, not just look at the experience of Southeast Asia, but perhaps also look at the experiences of Northern Europe. With regard to the so-called lumpen proletariat, perhaps I should start off by just asserting that we also have a lumpen elite. We shouldn't forget about that. In business, in politics, in the union movement, in civil society, in the professions, people who survive through rent-seeking and corruption amongst the elites. So when we talk about, in inverted commas, lumpenism, we shouldn't only look at the poor. But coming to the question of the lumpen proletariat and July 2021, the point has been made that given the levels of poverty and inequality in South Africa, before 1994 and since 1994, we have always, as a society, had social tinder that threatens to catch fire. And perhaps the question that arises is, why did it catch fire in the same manner as in the July failed insurrection all along? There have been protests, yes, but not at the level that we saw in July. In my view, it is because there's been, in inverted commas, delivery. Might not be adequate, but there's been creation of jobs, there's been an expansion to access to education, both basic education and tertiary education. There are issues to do with economic empowerment and so on and so forth. So delivery has happened, it might not be adequate, and that helped stem the kind of uprisings that as unequal a society as ours can have. But in addition to that, there has also been hope and trust. Trust that the government intends to do the right thing, and hope that even if I may not have benefited from water or electricity in my village, I can see across the river that something is happening. This has, in the recent period, been undermined by the slow pace of implementation of these programs, by the growing inequality, and of course, by corruption and state capture. What we also cannot ignore is the fact that COVID worsened all those social difficulties. And it's a combination of all those things that have led to the kind of uprising that we had in July. But also, as we look at that uprising, in my view, we should look at the terrible things that happened, but we should also remember that there was mobilization of civil society, what one would call the people in political motion for good. People who sought to stop it, people who went to guard the various facilities, and people who cleaned them. And it is those positive impulses that we should encourage. Lastly, on the issue raised by, I think it was Neil Coleman, should we simplify state regulations? I would agree, but perhaps before I come to that, talking about July, we also should not forget that there was an element of orchestration, because it's a matter that also needs to be investigated and dealt with. On regulations, just to make the point that they can be very bureaucratic. Yes, they need to be simplified, but we do need regulations, PFMA and all kinds of statutes in order to ensure that people operate within certain parameters. But I think one good example of how terrible these regulations can be was what some of us learned with shock in the past week or so about how difficult it is for ESCOM to order spare parts and do the urgent things that are required, because they have to go through complicated processes through National Treasury. Why that has not been simplified, one doesn't quite understand. So I would agree, while saying that regulations are necessary, we need to simplify them where necessary. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joel. Thank you for bringing the whole discussion to a wonderful crescendo. I would like to now hand over to our co-host, Rashid Sidat, Executive Director of the GCRO, to make some concluding remarks. Over to you, Rash.
Okay. Good afternoon, colleagues and participants. Thank you very much. So my job is to do a bit of summing up, kind of try and synthesize as much as possible. So give me about 5 minutes, Eva, or so, because I think it's been a very long, rich, interesting, insightful discussion. And I don't think I've captured everything, because the chat line was extremely busy, and just kind of scrolling up and down and trying to pick up on all of the threads was not really possible. But I'm going to do my best. And of course, when we write this up in the provocation, I think we will take into account all of that. But I thought that it might be useful just for us to have some kind of structure. It's a very elementary structure, but at least it gives us some idea about how we're going to take things forward. So firstly, just to say that we were absolutely gratified by the kind of interest that has been shown. For each of, in the 3 webinar series, we've had like a couple of 100 registrations showing an immense amount of interest. Today's actual attendance was in the order of, I think, well, it reached a sort of maximum number of about 138, which is really great. And also, I think what we found is that many people kind of came back, which was actually really good. In other words, they could see the thread that we're actually pulling. So, I mean, this thread is now kind of at the final point. But also, interestingly enough, I mean, in the last two webinars, the issue around the role of government or the state is, I think Joel corrected us more broadly, I think is really central to addressing a lot of the issues. So I think that it was actually, it makes perfect sense for us to do it in that way. Just to move on, I think many of the colleagues and the participants spoke about, I think, the context and the backdrop, which I think is fairly well known. I'm not going to spend too much time, but I think it's just worth repeating some of it. So, of course, the whole area of state capture, corruption, patronage, rent-seeking regime, call it what you want to. I think that sort of set of issues have been quite devastating to the capability of the state going forward. Of course, COVID-19 came out of the blue, as it were, and I think really disrupted a lot of the kind of you know, well, hopefully, I think the attempt at rebuilding that had been started. We know there's been declining levels of service delivery at all levels. The electricity crisis, what can I say? Catered development. I mean, this thing about this innocuously named business forums. I mean, when I worked in government, and I worked in government for a long time, but the last five years or so, we've just seen this thing called business forums, and actually they are really sinister. And in fact, all they're doing is resorting to extortion. And I think that, and there are many other things that the state has been unable to address, things like the zama-zamas, I think regulation of the taxi industry. So there are many areas where the state has needed to intervene, but it has not been able to intervene effectively. I think colleagues have been talking about instability in the civil service and the sort of general dysfunctionality of the state. The one issue that has been raised, which has also been my particular bugbear, is compliance gone mad. And it's in fact, I can spend an hour telling you about how public servants have to actually get involved in all sorts of things, which actually are layers and layers of attempts to address problems and corruption and so on, but actually just increase the level of bureaucratization. And I think that that is certainly a big problem in relation to where we're going. Now, what has been the impact of all of these things? I think that I think, you know, again, declining capacity of the state, the negative culture within the bureaucracy, and I think Graham's point about sliding satisfaction with government, the empirical evidence for that, as did Harsha, talking about the deficit of trust. Nomzamo spoke about illegal arrests and the unconstitutional behavior of the state. Also, I think Graham spoke about the realignment of political allegiances, the rise, for example, of Action SA, general issues around legitimacy of the state. And I mean, again, just to repeat Nomzano's point about the incapacity of the police to effectively manage the July uprising. We saw the National Commissioner the other day at the Human Rights Commission hearings, just saying, well, actually, there's nothing we could do. The former Minister of Defense said, well, you know, nobody wants to cooperate with us. So these are the people at the top level who basically said, well, you know, I mean, we just were completely incapable of actually dealing with this matter. So a pretty severe indictment on the role and capacity of the state to actually manage crises. I mean, like the radio talk hosts were talking about, well, in Gauteng, there are only 2 water cannons. Okay, I mean, that was an interesting thing, but it just shows, I mean, the pre-planning around some of these things and anticipating, you know, future crises. So you just deal with the day-to-day things, pay the salaries and but I mean, are you procuring in the right way? But procurement can be a double-edged sword, frankly. I mean, then they're not used, it'll be fruitless expenditure. So there are always these sorts of difficulties that you're going to find. I mean, and I'll say something very controversial here. I mean, the issues around PPP, there's definitely been corruption without a doubt. But I can tell you some of it, and I worked in government at the time, some of it was well-intentioned. Of course, the prices were ridiculous and all of that. But I mean, like doing defogging, at that time, we didn't know that defogging is actually useless. Okay, so I'm just saying that you always kind of, as a public servant, you're walking a kind of a tightrope. So I think that needs to be taken into account. So the issue then comes down to what on earth do we do? How do we get to where we want to be? And that a lot of the participants were saying, well, I want to hear more of that. And that's right. And I think there were lots of things that did come through in little nuggets and pieces. And I'm just going to mention and very quickly run through them, because I think they will provide the skeleton for us to sort of take this thing forward and flesh it out later on. By the way, I mean, I think Graham responded to the future of provinces as a constitutional issue. I'm not sure whether we should go there. But of course, there's a general issue about reorganizing of the state. But how do you do it? And I think Graham's provocation was, well, the grand kind of McKinsey type report is actually not the way to go. And how do we do this in perhaps in a somewhat incremental fashion, and taking it forward, obviously with having something inside. So I think the how is the issue. And I think we've seen failed attempts after the failed attempts. I can tell you, like, I know I worked in Gauteng province for 10 years. There were probably like 3 or 4 or 5 different attempts at fixing up the health department. Okay. And if you go and you look at the reports, I mean, the analysis of what the problem is all the same, actually. And then, and very similar prescriptions, pardon the pun, in health, but I mean, I think that they haven't worked until today. So I think how you do it is certainly an issue. Another issue that came up in all of the previous webinars and today's as well, and Joel also raised the issue of social compacting, but of course, I think the issues around embedded autonomy, again, I think is that sort of tension that you need to mediate. And I think a lot of colleagues have been raising that particular issue to make sure that, it doesn't go too far on the other side. Joel raised the issue about meritocracy, bureaucratic capacity. By the way, I don't like, to use the word bureaucracy. I think we shouldn't be using pejorative words to describe, I think, a very important function in the state. And let's call people public servants. I think it conveys a different idea. Okay, and so I'm just saying in general, I don't like, bureaucrat and technocrat. I think it sends the wrong message. But public service is very important. What do we do? I mean, I agree. I think the meritocracy addresses the issue of cadre development or deployment, and the general and issues around professionalization of the public services. I saw that some public policy outfit has done some work on this matter, and I think we should be looking at that. The issue that Joel also raised about joint leadership and integration. I mean, whenever I go onto a public platform, this is the issue, the holy grail. I mean, everyone's kind of searching for it, but nobody ever gets to it. Jits in his input said, well, I mean, these are all tired solutions. I agree with that. But I think let's see if we can't make this damn thing work. Pardon the language, but I think that it is a source of a lot of frustration to try and get that vertical and horizontal integration that we're talking about. Harsha said, I mean, building trust, stability, and legitimacy is also a process, not only an outcome. So as we do this incrementally, hopefully in a sort of iterative way, we basically kind of, spiraling upwards, and sort of building that trust, building the capacity, etc., as we as we go towards the outcome of actually building, the kind of public service that we're looking for. I think the issue, addressing the issues of criminality that was raised by Nomzamo, but also in a way in which you don't, I think that people's constitutional rights are adhered to. Some colleagues have raised issues of extension of social security. I think Neil Coleman was speaking about that, and Big, and so on. So I mean, that is, I know that's an ongoing macroeconomic debate, but it's something that we need to kind of work out at some point as part of the sort of social compacting that we're talking about. There was issue about, I think Graham raised it, about what are the sort of working norms of a functioning state, the internal issues, the culture, the hygiene issues, as they call it. I think that a lot has to be desired in relation to those particular matters. Faisal Knight raised the issue of digitization of public services. I think there's a lot to be said about that. I mean, is the question that arises, is it possible to leapfrog service delivery through digitization of public services? But of course, taking into account the risks that it involves, the corruption issues, the crazy costings that these tech companies basically impose and so on. But I think that there is something to be said about that. We can't have this like every day on radio and TV, talk show hosts complaining about how long they're standing in home affairs queues and so on. I'm really done. And then, of course, I think the issue that Neil was raising about simplifying state regulations, as I said, I think that's something that we need to look at. I mean, let me just give you one example. You would spend, like senior managers in every department would spend like, every quarter, 2 days every quarter looking at the risk register. The risk register, by the way, is a completely, utterly useless thing. I'm sorry to say. It's a waste of time. Okay, I mean, no risks actually get addressed, quite frankly. And I can tell you that sitting in a very senior position in government when I was there very recently. So things like that, I think we need to relook at. So where does this take us? This takes us to a couple of things in relation to the outcomes. I think the issue around trust and legitimacy as an outcome that Harsha was raising. I think Nomzano's issues about, I mean, let's adhere to the Constitution and some of the principles that derive from the Constitution, like social justice, equitable society, and so on. And then, and hopefully, well, this, I guess, is both a process and outcome, but I quite liked Joel's notion of ideational leadership. I hope I pronounced it correctly. And I found a little definition, which I'm going to sort of finish with, and that is formalization of the processes involved in the gathering, sharing, analyzing, and executing ideas within an organization and collaborative networks. Thank you.
Thank you. You enlighten us as you enlighten yourself, Rash. So before everyone heads for the bar, let me just say the vote of thanks. Firstly, I want to thank all the speakers for today, Harsha, Graham, Nomzamo, Kwezi, and Joel. Thank you very much for your erudite inputs and the questions that were raised. I want to thank all the participants and contributors at this session and previous session, all the speakers that were at previous session, all those that you attended today and previous session. Thank you very much. None of this is possible, obviously, with the whole team that was responsible for pulling it together. So we had Melinda Swift, Ruth Mohammed, and Rash Sidat from GCRO. Thanks for all your work in the coordination, conceptualizing, facilitation, and provocation. Then on the Mistra side, Sipokazi and Noma, thank you for your media and comms and tech support. Gillian Murray and Alex Parker for the media and comms support. And then Laith Davis, the graphic design for promotional material and mailers. And as I said, there's been a number of speakers on the previous panels that were really important. I'm not going to go through all that. and who facilitated some of the sessions, but I want to thank them all now in their presence and some of them in their absence. Last but not least goes to Dr. Tamlin Fleetwood. When they told me that, when GCRO said they had an event organizer, I said, okay, let's see what she's capable of, and will she be able to manage this crazy bunch that we've put together. So Tamlin, you've done a brilliant job in pulling it together, keeping us tight, bringing the energy that you did, the professionalism that you raised our own sessions, and the help that you provided for each one of the speakers. So thanks to everybody. Thanks to all. Big, big thank you. And we look forward to the publication of the provocation. We'll stay in touch with you how we're going to manage that. Thanks to all. Have a good day.
Sorry, can I just say one thing? Yeah, I was supposed to do that, and I'll get clapped if I didn't say it. It was my job to thank Abba, and
you didn't have to.
And he conveniently left his name out. Obviously, I would do the same, but Abba has been a fantastic partner. I think when we started this process, we sort of went into it, and I think we worked really well. And just to say this to Joel, that I mean, it bodes very well for a kind of ongoing relationship with MISTRA into the future. So Abba, thanks a lot for the amazing partnership. Thank you. Sorry for saying the last word.
No problem. Thank you. That I don't mind you saying, especially in front of my boss. Thank you. Okay, take care, everybody. Have a good evening. Have a good day.